On today's World Insight, China's economy showing resilience, what the latest Chinese industrial indicators tell us, and a ringside view of China's growth for decades. In the words of an old China hand, Swiss magnate Uli Sigg.
The talk would provide me another access to Chinese reality.
Here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live on CGTN from Beijing. We begin with today's show at China's economy, based on National Bureau of Statistics data released on Friday. The profits of China's industrial companies grew in November, the fastest pace in 8 months. It broke a 3-month declining streak. What does it mean for China's economy? Before we get down to a discussion, take a look at these numbers.
Profitability at Chinese industrial enterprises improved significantly in November. The latest figures have given economists cause for optimism about China's prospects for next year. Data from the National Bureau of Statistics show that China's industrial profits rose 5.4% from a year earlier to 593.9 billion yuan in November. That's steep compared with a 9.9% drop in October. What's noteworthy is that private firms and small enterprises outperformed the whole sector. Their profit growth rates stood at 14.7% and 8.6% year-on-year, respectively. The expansion was mostly due to quickening production and sales, while factory gate prices contracted at a slower pace, said Tu Hong, a Statistics Bureau official, through a statement released alongside the data. Industrial production rose at the fastest clip in 5 months in November amid easing trade tensions with Washington. China and the United States cooled their 17-month-long trade war earlier this month, announcing a Phase 1 agreement that would cut some U.S. tariffs in exchange for more Chinese purchases of American farm products. Chinese President Xi Jinping and U.S. President Donald Trump spoke on the phone last Friday, with a confirmed deal in the pipeline. Analysts say the surge in industrial profit growth could be short-lived due to strong growth headwinds and a high degree of uncertainty that still surrounds trade relations between China and the U.S.
For more on the Chinese economy, we're joined in Hong Kong by Everett Xie, who is the chairman and CEO of Gaofeng Advisory Company. In New York, we invited Max Wolf, managing partner of Multivariate, and also in our Beijing studio, Liu Baocheng, dean from the Center for International Business Ethics from University of International Business and Economics. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. So, looking at the numbers, Professor Liu, very briefly first, what do you make of them?
Well, these numbers tells a mixed story. On one hand, there are positive impetus. We have a 5 months high of the industrial added value, and the infrastructure is on the rise. Except the real estate, the manufacture is also on a climbing side. But business confidence needs time to be really rehabilitated. And now that, with the prospect of further easing, and 1 trillion is already declared for local governments for infrastructure. So, and also, with the stabilization of the China-U.S. trade war by the Phase 1 in the pipeline, I think the business confidence is now beginning to shore up.
I see. Mr. Xie, Professor Liu mentioned a whole mixture of many signs. How should we read out of all of these numbers and also possibilities? Your take.
Yeah, my take is that this reflects a renewal of confidence by the businesses, in particular by the private sector businesses. I think the settlement of the Phase 1 of the U.S.-China trade discussion really helped to clarify a lot of the uncertainties. And the demand side from the consumers have rejuvenated quite a bit. And therefore, I think it has created this upsurge in the profits from the Chinese companies.
Well, the certainty, Mr. Xie, if I could, very briefly from you, going to be long-lived, or is it very temporary, as this is only the phase one, as we discussed?
Well, certainty is a function of external conditions, in particular the relationship between China and the U.S., but also in the global sort of economic climate. For now, this is, pretty short-lived. For next year, it's unsure whether or not this uncertainty or certainty will continue to prevail, but we'll see.
Mr. Wolf, well, China's numbers are coming out to a certain extent. We also see numbers coming from Washington as well about the U.S. economy. So what do you make of the two economies trying to survive and thrive out of these trade war, quote unquote? Mr. Wolf.
Yes, so it's always great to be here. Thanks for having me. I think the U.S. and the China economic scenarios have some shared issues as well as some very different issues. In the U.S., we're seeing massive, consistent stimulus from the government. So massive fiscal stimulus. The Trump administration will have deficit spent about $1 trillion in 2019 in order to get about $400 billion in growth. So we have the twin problems of a huge fiscal stimulus, really aggressive spending, never really seen before outside of a recession. At the same time as we've cut taxes, so the deficit's huge, and we've also been keeping the interest rates incredibly low. So we are stimulating the economy massively. I think the president has some issues, some sort of heavy burden on his back, which is affecting economic policymaking. It's ideally it shouldn't be, but it is, and that's, he's in the process of an impeachment right now, and we know there's a big election coming in a little bit less than 10 months, basically, a little bit more than 10 months now, so it's all going to be about that. The president needed a deal, and so we got at least a deal announced. We haven't seen all the detail yet, and I think it's very hard to believe that the deal can be permanent, although I'd love to see that, just because the sticking point to a lot of the trade issues has been about the conduct and public utterances of the president, and I'm not sure his personality is as easy to change as a trade agreement is to reach.
But what about China's case from your reading?
Yeah, so it looks to me like the Chinese case is really framed by a few things going on. One is the world economy is at a rapid period of change and volatility, both politically and economically. China has largely sidestepped the political volatility, but the economic volatility is certainly there, and I think what you're seeing is an adjustment of a Chinese economy to a greater inward focus, and that's never without some bumps in the road, some difficulties, and a system of trading partners that's shifting because there's beginning to be a sort of free trade world and a not free trade world, and the people who once led the free trade world are slipping into the not so free trade world, and so the players are changing the roles they want to play in the drama. I think what you're seeing in China is a little bit of a natural economic recovery that's hitting at around the same time as the stimulus.
Right.
So again, looks pretty good in the mid to short term, harder to see beyond that right now.
Very interesting what you have just said, Mr. Wolf, because we have seen both China and the United States, the earlier so-called invisible hands are becoming ever more visible as a result of government efforts in order to encourage the growth of economy. Professor Liu, what do you make of that interesting phenomenon?
Well, I think now China is really shifting between two hands in terms of the proportion. And right now, we do notice a positive sign that the government is trying to give more the say for the invisible hands now, particularly identified by the 28 principles, which has been recently published to provide the private businesses in a sort of equal level playing field with foreign business and SOEs, and reform is still going on. So I think now we really want the benefit of both ends, but sometimes if you do not really walk a fine line, and the pendulum can really shift, which will not really bring to the best outcome.
Okay, Mr. Xie, your take on that, and also with the question that there seems to be a mixture, once again, of policies. First of all, there is the 28, as Professor Liu just mentioned, and also there's opening up as well further to the outside world. Import certainly have been increasing tremendously, even though China's import from the U.S. has been going down, but from the rest of the world have been going up, and therefore the whole total volume going up as well. So, Mr. Xie, how do you see all of this are contributing to the real realities of Chinese economy and potentially in the near future?
Well, the Chinese government have always played a pretty visible hand, as you know, throughout the years. And in almost all cases, it's been pretty effective in directing the direction of the country. What's unique about China is that it's not only about the government's visible hand, but also it has a thriving entrepreneurial class. The private sector is expanding, and it's very active, and it's been a major source of job creation. I think this model that the Chinese has developed is really a major source of resilience of economic growth. The development of the relationship with the U.S., in particular with the U.S. And China trade war or trade dispute, have really accelerated China's reform in the process of market access, and also creating more opportunities for private sector businesses to compete with the state-owned enterprises businesses. In my view, competition is good, and I think China is going in the right direction, perhaps also with the right speed. Opening up is always good. It's going to create some challenges for some of the weaker companies who may be sort of loose along the side. But overall speaking, it's going to improve the productivity and the efficiency of the whole system. I think this is the right direction.
Of course, China is also at the same time, Professor Liu, trying to restructure its economy, try to rely more on domestic consumption rather than exports, which were the case earlier, which also create some kind of controversy between China and some of the other countries, U.S. included. But the question really is whether the domestic consumption will be really strong to meet the leftover part that has been created as a result of trade dispute, and also at the same time whether real jobs can be created as a result of so-called consumption-driven economy.
A brief reflection of the Chinese model, I should say that a past success may not really be the sure recipe for the future success, because when Chinese economy is getting more and more sophisticated and more intertwined with the rest of the world, so I think to let the market to play a more important role instead of government rigid command is more important. As for the consumption, yes, we do see a good picture. The consumption takes more than 60% of the GDP, but in the meantime, given China's vast population and also uneven development, so manufacture is still the key. So for quite a while, manufacture has been ignored. We are trying to use the formula of the developed world to measure Chinese economic quality, and now I think the government and also business circles have realized that real economy is the sure thing. So because without the right quality, without the sizable employment that can be provided by the manufacturing sector, only relying boys running on the scooters to deliver food, simply relying on Jack Ma's creation, it does not really provide good quality and good prospect to Chinese economy.
Well, that is part of the economy, but it's not whole economy,
right.
Of course. Manufacturing is still important. To the U.S., manufacturing is also important. That, at least according to the current Washington and the current White House, Professor Wolf. As a result of this, how do you see this new lineup of global manufacturing chain in a way? And how is that likely to be interacting with the global value chain, global supply chain changes? Will China and the U.S. More in competition about those areas?
Yeah, so I think the U.S. administration and U.S. politically is obsessed with the idea of manufacturing, largely because it conjures up images and moves people's hearts possibly more than their heads, in terms of thinking of a day where we had a vast middle class. And talking about manufacturing is kind of the way the American political right engages a vast majority of less economically well-paid middle-class voters and wins elections. And there's been a sort of unfortunate and incorrect factually effort to associate losses in manufacturing in the U.S. with international trade. So manufacturing is still important to the U.S. It actually, the amount of value we produce each year in manufacturing, unlike in some states, has not actually gone down across the past many decades. What has happened, though, is a lot of mechanization and a lot of change in what we manufacture and how we manufacture it, and that has taken the employment base much, much, much lower and shifted who does work, by the way. A lot of college-educated engineers as opposed to as many people performing rote or repetitious and physical labor. So it's changed a bit. But I think the United States wants to be an advanced manufacturer. We always were. We need to be. I don't think that changes that much, but I think China is manufacturing to manufacture its future. America is manufacturing to try to get back to its past in some cases. And clearly aiming and evolving toward the future is a more viable long-term industrial policy than announcing the sort of second chance to live in the past. That usually doesn't end all that well.
We'll see how it turns out. But Mr. Xie, if you look at China-U.S. relations, which is a big factor impacting at least the psychology of the world economy, and certainly the two economies, China and U.S. as well, is that there is an extreme danger of the so-called the new Cold War, also the extreme danger of the decoupling, technologically speaking, as well as, in financial and economic terms, so-called the currency wars and other trade wars. So how do you see all of these mixtures of things and its possibility have on China's economy? How much do you think China will be able to, under the current circumstances, strengthen its own economy from within in order to, brave the storm, as they say, if there were further storms to come?
Yeah, my guess is that there will be further storms to come, unfortunately, for next year. But how and when, I cannot precisely predict. But I think one can presume there will be additional uncertainty and volatility in place. I think this is very important for the Chinese policymakers to make sure that there will be hedges against this kind of uncertainty and volatility. One is to continue to really work with the domestic economy and try to drum up the consumption side and the investment side to make sure that there's enough demand for businesses. The other is, of course, the world is a large world. It's not, America is very strong, but the world is not only about America. There are many other countries in the world. I think in the process, China has been increasing its trade ties with many other parts of the world, and I could imagine that China will continue to do that next year.
Professor Liu, do you think that will be the way out? You see the Chinese leaders very active in the recent China, Japan, and South Korea interactions over the past few days. You also see Chinese leaders as well as business delegations really active in Europe as well as other parts of developing countries as well. So Belt and Road, another thing, of course. Professor Liu, will that be able to make up to the uncertainty, as Mr. Xie just pointed out?
I think much of the homework is still at home because China has a vast economy, and now how to adjust to the state versus the market is still a big homework that we really need to streamline. So with a strong and unified economy, and when market players are getting more robust, and the rest of the job for global expansion and global responsibility will be an easier task.
Yeah.
And the fact that the China-U.S. is able to sign the Phase 1 shows that actually there are a lot of...
We are still waiting
for
the signing of the Phase 1. There is the announcement of the so-called agreement.
At least there has been agreement in the pipeline.
Yeah.
So it shows that the homework is still how to allow market players to play on an equal footing, and how to introduce the rule of law, and how to dismantle a lot of hidden barriers, both with the global community and within China itself. And it's still something that is really the ultimate solution instead of looking at all those technical areas.
Before we go, one final question for you, Professor Liu. Jobs, jobs, jobs. That's going to be the key. That's going to be the key to everything, to economy, to stability, to a lot of things. So jobs next year?
Yes. I think now the government has realized that only by promoting mobility of people from different spaces, so that they can really look for the best fit of the skill versus job is important. So the recent release of the policy is very welcome. And the other is how we can really retrain those people who can really be upgraded over their skill sets for new job opportunities. So that's also quite a challenge.
I see. Professor Wolf, from your perspective, how do you see that issue also? Jobs, jobs, jobs.
Jobs is huge. In the United States, I think our story might be a tiny bit different only because it's wages, wages, wages. So we've had a tight labor market in the U.S., which looks good and is good, but we've had wage stagnation, and we've also had whole blocks of the economy here migrate from the traditional employment, which our numbers are good at capturing, to become independent contractors and on this gig economy that we have. And we still don't know how that works, but I think if you re-envision sort of including that in the numbers don't look as good. But I think in the U.S. might be wages, 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 because we tend to do well when people spend more, and if they spend more without the wages, we saw what happens eventually with that model in 2008.
I see. Mr. Xie, final words from you. Jobs? Jobs or wages?
Yeah, it's very critical, of course, to create jobs. I think for China, it has already done a pretty good job over the last several years on innovation, and as you know, innovation enhances productivity and also create jobs. In my view, that trend will continue to go on, albeit could be a bit challenging in some of the sectors. But the private sector businesses are very innovative in China, and I believe that they will be a major source of job creation for China for next year.
Even though we have been hearing some latest stories related to the private sector also trying to make it happen, we'll see how things will evolve from here. For now, I want to thank the three of you for joining us. Edward Xie, Max Wolf, last but not least, Liu Baocheng. Really appreciate it, gentlemen. Thank you so much. You're watching World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing. Still to come on our program, a ringside view of China's growth for decades. The words of a real China hand, the Swiss magnate Uli Sigg, the largest Chinese contemporary art collector in the world, right after this break. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing. China's growth in the past several decades was unprecedented, some say, in human history. Many from different parts of the world have witnessed those moments up close, and they have been telling stories from their own experience. Rarely has anyone left his or her mark like the one we're about to meet today. With utmost curiosity, sincerity, and generosity, Uli Sigg, a businessman, a diplomat, has hitched his life with that of China over the past 40 years through contemporary art. Uli Sigg started his entangled life with China as a businessman who tested the waters at the very beginning of the country's reform and opening up by establishing the first industrial joint venture between China and the West. Later, as Swiss ambassador to China, he laid the foundation of business exchanges between the two countries. Over the years, he became the biggest collector of Chinese contemporary art in the world. Through that collection, he chronologically saves the most recent memories of China's pain and happiness.
It was a very organic process because I had this desire to learn more about China. I was totally ignorant when I came here, and already in the early days I thought that art would provide me another access to Chinese reality from what I would see as a business person. At that time I was looking, and in fact I didn't think it was so exciting.
Why not?
The paintings at that time, first exhibition called Star Exhibition, small oil paintings, and you would think, looking with a Western eye, maybe it's painted 100 years too late.
Did you tell the artist?
No, because they were not yet in the know what had happened in Western contemporary art, and they did not have access yet to all the apparatus a Western artist would have, like a video camera, like even a computer later. You know, all these things were out of the budget of most artists.
Who's the artist that you originally collected?
Actually, the first artist work I collected, this artist disappeared from the scene, actually soon afterwards.
Interesting.
That shows you the risk of collecting contemporary art anywhere. These artists may rise, they may fall, they may cease to do art. That's an example of someone who just disappeared.
What is that work about?
It's actually a work by a female artist. It's kind of flowery thing, and yeah, that was earliest work.
You know, what were some of those most well-known Chinese contemporary artists of the day now like at that time? For example, Xu Bing.
Xu Bing is without a doubt one of the most important Chinese artists of his generation. When China finally opened its doors to the world, Xu Bing, already a well-regarded artist at that point, seized the opportunity to move to New York in 1990.
He, of course, young man then, very original thinker. We met in the States. So, of course, we talk about his work, and we talk about the situation of a Chinese artist, you know, living in the Western world and making his entry into the Western art world.
What about Wang Guangyi?
Well, he was, of course, living here, and he, well, had already a lot of self-confidence at the time, and he, you know, did not much care whether, say, Western people would understand what he was doing, but actually, a Western audience could access his work very well, better than many other artists' works.
His avant-garde artworks and extraordinary commercial success led him to be renowned globally as an important contributor to the contemporary art scene.
You know, he sort of brought like Chinese advertising and Western advertising on one surface. So that was also understandable to a Western person not so familiar with China.
What about Feng Mengbo?
这个就是《Long March Restart》，2008年完成的。
He was the first artist in China owning a computer, and we discussed in a small apartment about his work, and he actually already started a communication with some software people in the West, and they were just struck what he was able to do. They couldn't explain how he could, you know, as an individual with just a small Apple computer, do these things he actually did.
You brought him to Venice Biennale. It's almost like a come-out party for the Chinese contemporary artists, together with Mr. Harold Zeman.
Well,
some say it's been too commercialized since then. Did you regret?
Of course not. You know, if commercialized, then there is one privilege for artists. They make a better living. But I think they still produced very good art, meaningful art. And yes, this was a kind of a watershed, because it had, for the first time, the big international public having to look at Chinese contemporary art. Before, it was basically ignored. This time, things were different. And then, you know, the boom, which led to an enormous price rise until the whole art world crashed 2008.
And of course, you see the ups and downs of their works in the international art market. It's interesting that you, who started collecting Chinese contemporary art much before everybody else, now still go door hopping, shall I say, when you come to Beijing or other parts of China to visit the artists?
For me, it's very important because it allows me to look into people's lives. I may not have this access as a foreigner. For me, it's not so much about taking home a finished product from a gallery. Actually, this process of meeting the artist, seeing the environment, discussing work, discussing thoughts, is the thing rather than the product.
What drives you?
Art is like vacationing in my own mind. So
do you have long vacations?
Yes, no, maybe many at least. This way, it triggers my thinking. So it's like a drug in my case. So wherever I would be, I would have an interest. What are the artists of that space doing?
Many say Chinese artists have this luxury that other artists probably in the rest of the world could hardly have, which is a dramatic change in society. A lot of pressure, a lot of contrast, conflicts, challenges, opportunities, personal experiences, all at the same time, explosion of things. Do you think that's true?
I think that's true. It may sound a bit cynical even, that big tensions in a society and big ruptures and speed and fast development and urbanization on such a scale, many experiments as China does, no one ever did. This is conducive to create art for an artist. In the Western world, in many situations, many countries, the artists don't have such a resource. So they may dwell more on formal issues, etc. Also fine, but I think the very specific situation of China leads to quite an interesting art creation.
How much artists will still be able to reflect in their works what's going on in their real life, the context of their real life?
Maybe today's art scene is not political as it was in the 80s or 90s, because lives, developed differently in China. People now have other priorities, and there are issues like consumerism, issues like identity, urbanization. So these issues may not directly appear so political.
But it doesn't mean the tension could be less. It doesn't mean there are conflicts.
It doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean that. Also, today's art world is very often less about a very impactful, direct message. Artists prefer to be ambiguous and open up a space so the viewer, will fill that space somehow. So the art goes somewhere else than from being very placative and direct.
Do you think Chinese these days like Chinese contemporary art?
It's still a small segment of Chinese society.
Explain, please.
Looking at it, because contemporary art is made according to a very different paradigm than the traditional art. Of course, everyone familiar with traditional art, where you develop the tradition, you build on whatever there is, and it's about beauty, it's about harmony. Contemporary art made to a very different paradigm. Contemporary art very often does away with everything there is, and starts on the green field. Yeah. And beauty may be there, but is not important. And it is more reflecting on society. It's also being critical about society, and it depicts the world as it is, not as it ought to be, like the tradition very often did. That's a big difference, and not everyone can follow that spirit, or it takes exposure. If you can't see the contemporary art, if you don't see it, then, well, how could you understand it? How would you collect it? So that spiral, first has to start to turn. Then the interest for contemporary art grows. And we are somewhere there. But then there's also now more and more access to international art. So all of a sudden, many Chinese collectors who in the past only looked at Chinese art now look at international art.
And of course, we were there at 798 earlier. We walk around. We saw a lot of Chinese are curious about Chinese contemporary art and even collecting. But do you think the way that the Chinese want to have, in hindsight, reflected in the artwork about China or about their daily life could be different from a foreign, let's just say, collector like you, or someone who collected systematically over the decades?
I, for myself, still maintain that the contemporary art maybe provides the best mirror for a society. Of course, you can read 100 books about China, some people may even do that. But to have, say, a real collection or exhibition of Chinese contemporary art just provides you the best insight into Chinese society. Not everyone may share my judgment, but for me, this is very clear.
For you, that is a window.
Very clear.
Nothing could compare.
Yes. And, it's also a window for the Chinese audience, just as much, if they take the time.
Chinese contemporary art did not come from nowhere. If you look at the very beginning of the PRC, 1949, revolutionary and themes related to that, the building of the country, to later different kinds of political movements, and then reform opening up, and the story goes on. How do you see Chinese contemporary art come into being, and how do you see the different stages of Chinese art over the past 7 decades? Well, you have to answer that probably in 2 minutes or so, rather than like a whole hour or a day.
Of course, for a long time, it was like ink on paper as a medium, and what we call modern art. That's what the Chinese know best. Then, of course, with the revolution came revolutionary art, and particularly under Chairman Mao, who took a liking to socialist realism. He had discovered for himself in the Soviet Union at the time. He brought the professors here, and they taught in the Chinese art academies oil painting, socialist realism. That art had to serve a purpose. It had to educate the masses. Then, once the Mao era came to an end and the open up, really took a hold, art for the first time became autonomous art. It was actually the artist decide what to do, what not to do, and that new autonomy created what we now call contemporary art.
And how is it likely to be developed in the near future? What's the thing that you're reading from your interaction with the artists?
I see mainly 2 directions. One is many artists want to go into this global mainstream art.
What does that mean?
Global mainstream art, this is the art we see all over the world, look ever more alike, in fact, and it's what also the market now is dominating, the big auctions. And then you have this other direction where the Chinese artists, after having tried, this global mainstream art and being somewhat disillusioned about it, turn to their own tradition again, which they neglected for long, with some exceptions. So, in my view, this
ink and watercolor painting.
Yeah, and the tradition and what it represents in terms of thought as well. So, I think this is also a very interesting strategy, because today you have to create your art by difference, even in this global mainstream art. And why not dig into your own resource, which is the Chinese culture? It's a very rich resource.
Are the Chinese artists keep on thinking?
Some yes, some a little bit less, but this is a global phenomenon. Not every artist is a genius, and You can't cut off your ear every day like as Van Gogh did. He also only cut it off one time, right?
Uli Sigg, the former Swiss ambassador to China, the largest contemporary art collector of China's works. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us, World Inside CGTN, into your search engine. Check out our YouTube channel, Facebook, Twitter as well. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for more insights across China and around the world. It's the last weekend of 2019, so make the most out of it. Enjoy, everyone. Bye for now.